Wealth arises from the division of labor and free exchange. When each individual pursues their own self-interest within a free market without artificial restrictions, productivity multiplies and society as a whole benefits, as if an invisible hand were coordinating the dispersed efforts of millions of people.
Wealth is generated by human labor transforming nature, not by the market. The problem is that in capitalism, this collectively generated wealth is privately appropriated by those who own the means of production. The truly best way to generate wealth is for those who produce it to also control it.
It is the foundation of all economic order. Without security regarding what one owns or produces, there is no incentive to invest, save, or improve. Private property, protected by clear laws, is what allows for the accumulation of capital and material progress.
I am not opposed to personal property, your clothes, your house, but to the private ownership of the means of production, factories, land, machines. This form of property allows one class to live off the labor of another. My proposal is to socialize it, not to abolish all individual ownership.
It generally helps. It is not out of benevolence that the baker gives us bread, but out of self-interest. And yet, we all eat. Competition between self-interested interests regulated by the market ends up serving the general interest better than any centralized planning.
That invisible hand is an illusion that masks exploitation. The capitalist's pursuit of individual profit results in low wages, long working hours, and periodic crises of overproduction. What benefits capital does not necessarily benefit the working class.
The free market, doubtless. Competition constantly forces innovation to avoid being left behind. Whoever finds a more efficient way to produce gains an advantage, and this pursuit of profit is the most powerful engine of technological progress.
It is true that capitalism has developed the productive forces like no previous system. I explicitly acknowledge this. But this same dynamism generates crises and technological unemployment. A socialist system without the pressure of private profit could direct innovation toward human needs rather than profitability.
According to what each factor of production, labor, capital, land, contributes in a market of freely negotiated wages. If wages are low, competition among employers eventually raises them, especially when the economy grows.
The worker produces more value than they receive in wages. This difference, surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist. Value should be distributed according to the principle from each according to their ability to each according to their work, and in a more advanced stage according to their need.
Yes, if the employer risks their capital, organizes production, and assumes the risk of loss, profit is the legitimate reward for that risk and management.
No. The capitalist does not create value. They only appropriate the difference between what the worker produces and what they receive. To call it risk is to disguise what is in reality a power relationship. Those who do not own the means of production must sell their labor power under disadvantageous conditions.
Differences in education, effort, luck, and access to capital. Some inequality is inevitable and even desirable as an incentive, although I also criticized the monopolies and privileges that distort the market in favor of a few.
Private ownership of the means of production. It is not an accident or a lack of individual effort. It is structural. As long as one class controls capital and another only has its labor power to sell, inequality will be systematically reproduced.
Free in the legal sense. No one is forced into a specific job, and they can negotiate, save, or change professions. The restrictions that harm this freedom are usually unions and regulations that limit labor mobility, not the market itself.
Formal, not real freedom. The worker chooses between selling their labor power or going hungry. They have no means of production of their own, so their freedom is reduced to choosing which capitalist to sell themselves to. I call this wage slavery precisely because of this lack of genuine alternative.
Limited to essential functions: defense, justice, infrastructure that the market does not efficiently provide, and basic education. The state should avoid interfering in prices and trade except in specific cases.
In capitalism, the state is largely an instrument of the ruling class. My goal is not an interventionist state within capitalism, but a revolutionary transformation that, after a transitional phase, leads to a classless society where the state as an apparatus of domination withers away.
The market, for the most part, because it allocates resources more efficiently than any planner. The state intervenes where the market clearly fails.
Neither the capitalist market nor the bourgeois state truly guarantees it. Both reflect the interests of those who own capital. Genuine well-being requires that ownership of the means of production be collectively owned.
Yes, I recognized the need to regulate banks, prevent harmful monopolies, and finance public works that no private entity would undertake due to a lack of direct profitability.
Within capitalism itself, certain reforms, working hours, social security, can improve the immediate situation of workers, and I supported them as transitional measures, but they do not resolve the fundamental contradiction of the system.
A certain degree is inevitable and functional. It reflects differences in talent and effort. But the extreme inequality generated by privileges and monopolies is not natural, but rather the product of poor economic policy.
It is a direct consequence of the capitalist mode of production, not a natural fact of the economy. Other systems, with a different organization of property, would generate radically different distribution patterns.
Equality of opportunity. Each person must compete on equal legal terms. The results will depend on the merit and effort of each individual.
Equality of opportunity is insufficient as long as some start with capital and others only with their labor power. Without a real distribution of the means of production, equality of opportunity is to a large extent formal.
Capitalism has lifted more people out of extreme poverty than any previous system in history by multiplying the production of goods. The problems that persist usually due to distorted markets, not the free market itself.
Poverty under capitalism is not a passing flaw, it is functional to the system. It needs a reserve army of unemployed to keep wages low. The experiments of real socialism in the 20th century had enormous failures, but I attribute that to their bureaucratic and authoritarian implementation, not to the idea of socializing the means of production itself.
I acknowledge that in my time there were abuses, exhausting working hours, child labor, and I criticized them. But the solution is not to abolish the market, but to improve conditions within it through competition, labor mobility, and, when necessary, targeted regulation. History shows that market economies have raised the average standard of living more than any centralized alternative.
I do not deny that capitalism has enormously increased total production. The problem is distribution. Prosperity is disproportionately concentrated in the hands of those who own capital, while generating cyclical crises, alienation, and precariousness for the majority who live on a wage.
Marx underestimates the market's capacity for self-correction and overestimates the viability of centralized planning without the incentives generated by private property and competition.
Smith confuses the functioning of the market with a natural and harmonious order, ignoring that relations of production are historical, not eternal, and that they conceal a relation of exploitation under the guise of free exchange between equals.
I would ask them to recognize market mechanisms and partial private ownership within their system to preserve incentives for productivity.
I would ask them to accept a structural redistribution of ownership of the means of production, not just cosmetic reforms within the same capitalist framework.
I would tell you, the free market, with its imperfections, has generated more material prosperity in 2 centuries than all previous systems combined. Your freedom to create, trade, and improve your life depends on that economic freedom being preserved.
I would tell you, ask yourself why with so much wealth produced collectively, the majority still depend on a wage to survive, while a few accumulate immense fortunes. That question is the starting point for imagining another economic organization.
The risk of centralized socialism is the concentration of power in the state, the loss of individual incentives, and, historically, authoritarian regimes that sacrificed freedom and economic efficiency.
The risk of unchecked capitalism is the extreme concentration of wealth, recurrent crises, and precariousness that erodes social cohesion and eventually the very stability of the system.
I accept that the market, without any regulation, can generate serious abuses, and that the uncontrolled concentration of capital deserves attention, something I myself criticized in the case of monopolies.
I accept that capitalism, in its actual functioning, has been extraordinarily efficient in developing the productive forces, something I openly acknowledged in my writings, although I disagree with its distributive consequences.
The freedom of each individual to pursue their own self-interest within fair rules generates more collective prosperity than any design imposed from above.
A society where producers collectively control what they produce is more just than one where the fruits of the labor of many enrich a few.